Good morning. In Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, our attention is brought to a period of time, 2,300 years. It's a time that started in 457 BCE and according to our calculations ends in 1844 CE. Now I want you to remember the question was, how long will this sanctuary be trampled on? How long will truth be trampled on? How long will it be that man is ignorant regarding the true plan of salvation? How long will it be until people get a correct understanding of what the Father is really about? What is his character like? Is he a God of love or not? And our attention is drawn that in 1844, this time period, a special emphasis was to be placed on the ministry of Christ. And I want you to remember that in the beginning, when Christ came his first time, it was to be man's substitute. It was to make provision for the sins that man committed. And it was also to reveal the truth regarding God's plan of salvation. Remember, John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world," and here we're referring to the Father, "that he gave us his Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." And I want to show you that this ministry that Christ started here is a ministry that he has continued with. But our attention is drawn in this time period, and a re-emphasis is drawn back to what Christ is really doing in God, in God's presence. I want you to recall that we notice how that Jesus, after his resurrection, went into the Father's presence, and how that the throne was set down and the Ancient of Days took his seat and judgment was set and books were opened. And the question is asked, who will be able to stand when God comes back to fetch his people? And this ministering work of Christ is the only way that God's people will be able to stand. Now, to show you what I'm doing, I want to draw your attention to two things that Christ does in his experience here on planet Earth. The first one I want to draw your attention to is John chapter 2, and I'm going to be reading from verse 12. After this, he went to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found men selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So I want you to notice he walks into the temple, and instead of the temple being a place where the plan of salvation is revealed, we notice here that it's become a marketplace. So in verse 15 it says, "He made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves he said, 'Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?'" So we see here that Christ is angry because what the plan of salvation was supposed to reveal, the character of God, the plan that God had to save mankind, had been obscured with man's thinking, with man's traditions, with the way in which man was planning to save himself. And he is angry about this. I want you to also notice that in Luke chapter 13, our attention is drawn to a very interesting story that also takes place again. Jesus, in Luke chapter 13, talks or mentions this parable. I'm going to start with verse 6. "A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but did not find any." You will recall how that in Jeremiah chapter 24, the fig tree symbolized Israel. And here we see that a man comes to this fig tree to look for fruit, but finds nothing. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, "For 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" "Sir," the man replied, "leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down. Here we see that for 3 years, this tree has been looked after, but it bears no fruit. There seems to be given this extra time to come around, this extra time to work the soil, to see if there is any way that fruits could come from this fig tree. And so the person who's the caretaker pleads for the Jewish nation. And this person pleading is really Jesus Christ. And I want you to notice that we're going to see this tomorrow. That in 1844, all the events pointing to the coming of Christ could have happened. But man was not yet ready to meet him, just like this fig tree. I want you to notice that if we go to Mark chapter 11, we find that Christ does something at the end of his ministry. Remember, it's 3.5 years later. He's worked with the Jewish nation. He's tried to get the soil ready. So we see here in verse 12, the next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. But when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. So here we see that Jesus approaches the fig tree again. And here we see that he's appealing to the Jewish nation. He's looking to see if his ministry was effective. But he still finds that although it seems as if there should be figs, there are only leaves. And he is disappointed, and he does this. He says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say this. So he curses this tree, and he says, "From now on, I'm actually looking to chop you down." On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. So we almost find ourselves back in the same situation, right at the beginning. We find Christ in the temple. He cleanses the temple. He gets the temple right. He spends 3.5 years working on it. He comes to the end of his experience. He walks back into the temple, and he sees that the people are again doing, but worse off than what the temple was before. It says there, he began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers"? So even though Christ had spent all this time trying to teach them the true plan of salvation, what the sanctuary was really all about, how that it was revealing the character of God, the love of God, and yet they had made it into a business venture again. They were selling the free gift of God, the gift of salvation, for gain. Dear friends, are we selling the plan of salvation to people? Are we asking them to do certain things, and in doing that we will give them salvation? Or is the plan of salvation God's free gift to us? His gift in Jesus Christ. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave us his Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish." But we've taken Christ and we've made him our possession, and we're now selling to others. And I want you to notice that what has happened through the years, and we notice in the Dark Ages, that the church made merchandise of the plan of salvation. And I understand that part of the cleansing work of Christ will to be set right again, the plan of salvation. I want you to notice something very interesting. After he's chased out the people in the sanctuary and he's cleansed it again, he's set it right again, I want you to notice something that happens in verse 20. "In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered.'" Dear friends, our destiny, our standing before God in the second coming depends on the ministry of Christ and of our response to it. I'm asking you, dear friends, will you allow Christ to be the husbandman in your life? Will you allow him to till the soil? Will you allow him to prepare you so that you will bear fruit, so that when he comes in the clouds of heaven to fetch you, that you will be ready? Will you allow him to do that? Tomorrow we're going to talk more about this. God bless you.